There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from spending your entire life with someone you don't really know, and that someone is you. Every morning you wake up in the same body, hear the same voice narrating your thoughts, carry the same memories and preferences and patterns of moving through the world. Somewhere along the way you started to believe that this familiarity meant understanding, that knowing what you like for breakfast or how you react when someone criticizes you is the same as truly knowing who you are. It isn't. Real self-knowledge isn't about cataloguing your preferences or predicting your reactions. And it's not about knowing that you're an introvert or that you have trust issues or that you're the reliable friend everyone calls when they need something. Those are just surface observations, the easy recognitions you make when you glance at yourself in passing. The way you might notice the colour of your eyes without ever really looking into them. Understanding yourself is something else entirely. The difference between recognising someone's face and understanding the architecture of their soul. When you describe yourself to others, you probably reach for the same handful of traits, the same biographical facts, the same carefully curated collection of characteristics that you've assembled over the years. You're organised, you're anxious, you value honesty, you had a difficult childhood. These things might all be true, but they're not you. They're the story you've learnt to tell about yourself, the narrative that feels safe and coherent and acceptable. Beneath that story, beneath the person you've learnt to perform, even when no one is watching, there's something else. Something vast and complicated and often contradictory. There's the you who exists in the space between what you say and what you mean, the you who makes decisions for reasons you don't fully understand, the you who reacts with surprising intensity to things that shouldn't matter while remaining oddly unmoved by things that should. This is the you that you live with, but rarely meet. Most of us spend our lives in a kind of trance, operating on autopilot, responding to the world through patterns we established so long ago that we've forgotten their patterns at all. We think we're choosing our responses, but we're actually just repeating them. We think we're living according to our values, when really we're just following scripts that were written for us by people who loved us or hurt us or needed us to be someone we weren't. The strange thing is that this isn't usually a problem, and you can live an entire life this way. Success comes, relationships form, you contribute to the world and experience joy and suffering and everything in between, all while remaining fundamentally unknown to yourself. Most people do, but there's a cost to this unknowing, a cost that you feel most acutely in those quiet moments when the performance drops and you're left alone with the question of who you really are. Not who you want to be, not who you tell people you are, but who you are in the deepest, most unvarnished sense. When you ask that honestly, you might find that you don't have an answer, or worse, you might find that the answer frightens you. True understanding means seeing yourself completely, not just the parts you're proud of, or the parts you've worked so hard to develop, but also the parts you've been hiding from. The selfishness beneath your generosity, the cruelty beneath your kindness, the fear beneath your confidence, the need beneath your independence. It means recognizing that you are not the hero of your own story, or at least not only the hero, and that you have been, at various times and in various ways, both the wounded and the one who wounds, both the abandoned and the one who abandons, both the victim of your circumstances and the architect of your own suffering. This is what makes self-understanding so rare, not that it's impossible, but that it requires a kind of courage most of us would rather not summon. The courage to look at yourself without flinching, to meet your own gaze in the mirror, and recognize not just the person you want to be, but the person you actually are. Understanding yourself is not a revelation, but an excavation. You have to dig through layers of accumulated sediment, years of other people's expectations, decades of learned responses, centuries of inherited beliefs about who you should be and how you should move through the world. Beneath all of that, if you dig deep enough and carefully enough, you start to find the fragments of something more original, something that was there before anyone told you who to be. The digging is slow work, and it's messy. Small things catch your attention at first, like the way your chest tightens when someone asks you for help, even though you've always prided yourself on being helpful. A flash of resentment toward people you claim to love appears and vanishes. You notice how you sabotage yourself right when things are going well, as if success itself is somehow dangerous. These are clues, breadcrumbs leading you back to something you've forgotten or never fully knew. Different questions start to form in your mind, not what do I want, but why do I want it, not how do I feel, but where does this feeling come from, not what should I do, but what am I actually doing, and what purpose does it serve? And that's when it gets uncomfortable, because when you start tracing your patterns back to their origins, you often find that they began as solutions to problems you faced long ago. The people-pleasing that exhausts you now once kept you safe in a household where love felt conditional. The emotional distance that protects you once shielded you from the pain of losing someone who couldn't stay. The perfectionism that drives you once proved to someone who doubted you that you were worthy of being kept. These adaptations were brilliant once, survival mechanisms carefully crafted by a younger version of you who was doing the best they could with the resources they had. That child deserved to be protected, and these patterns protected them. But you're not that child anymore, and the strategies that once saved you are now the ones that trap you. This is the heart of self-understanding, recognizing that you are not just who you've become, but also who you had to become. Many of the things you think of as your personality, your core traits, your nature, are actually adaptive responses that calcified into identity. Strength came because no one was strong for you. Invisibility developed because being seen was dangerous. Humor emerged because it diffused tension. Independence formed because depending on others led to disappointment. Agreeableness grew because conflict felt like annihilation. Over time, these learned behaviors became so automatic, so deeply embedded, that you started to believe they were simply you, not choices you made, but facts about who you are. They aren't facts, though, they're fossils. Preserved remnants of moments that shaped you, still influencing you long after those moments have passed. To understand yourself, you have to be willing to disturb these fossils, to examine them without judgment, to recognize them for what they are, evidence of your history, not prophecy of your future. This requires a particular kind of attention, not the harsh, critical scrutiny that comes so naturally to most of us, but something gentler, a kind of curious compassion. You have to be willing to look at your own behavior the way a scientist might examine a specimen, with interest rather than condemnation, with a desire to understand rather than to judge. Your defense mechanisms start to reveal themselves in action. The way you intellectualize emotions to avoid feeling them, the way you create chaos when things get too peaceful, the way you push people away right when they get too close, or cling to them right when they're trying to leave. The stories you tell yourself about why things happened protect you from more painful truths. And that's when you realize these mechanisms aren't random but form patterns, and those patterns have logic. They're not evidence of your brokenness, but of your adaptability. Proof that some part of you has always been trying to keep you safe, even if the methods it chose are no longer serving you. Recognizing these patterns is only the beginning, though, because the deeper work isn't just about identifying what you do or understanding why you do it. It's about meeting the part of yourself that's doing it with enough compassion that it feels safe enough to stop. Here's the paradox of self-understanding. You can't change what you don't accept, but accepting yourself means making peace with all the parts of you that you've been trying to change. It means acknowledging the ways you've hurt people, not because you're a bad person, but because you were hurt and didn't know how to hold that pain without passing it on. It means recognizing the ways you failed yourself, not because you lack discipline or character, but because you were trying to be someone you thought you should be, instead of discovering who you actually are. It means sitting with the uncomfortable truth that you contain multitudes, that you are both generous and selfish, both brave and afraid, both loving and capable of coldness. You hold within you the capacity for great beauty and great harm, often simultaneously. Somewhere in that acknowledgement, in that willingness to see yourself in your full contradictory complexity, something starts to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like ice melting at the edges, you begin to feel less at war with yourself, less fragmented, less like you're constantly trying to be someone other than who you are. You begin to understand that knowing yourself isn't about finding a fixed, stable identity that you can point to and say, "This is me." It's about becoming familiar with your own inner landscape, learning to recognize the weather patterns of your moods, the fault lines of your triggers, the underground rivers of your unexpressed grief. It's about developing a relationship with yourself that's honest enough to be useful, kind enough to be healing, and curious enough to keep evolving. here's what no one tells you about understanding yourself. It doesn't always feel like freedom, and sometimes it feels like loss. When you start to see yourself clearly, you also start to see all the ways you've been lying. Not maliciously, not consciously, but lying nonetheless. And to yourself most of all. You've been telling yourself that you're fine with being alone when really you're terrified of intimacy. That you're ambitious when really you're just trying to prove something to someone who will never be impressed. That you're over what happened when really you're still carrying it in your body, in the way you hold your shoulders, in the way you hold your breath when certain topics come up. And that's when those lies start to crumble. When you can no longer maintain the stories that have kept you functional. And there's a period of disorientation that can feel like falling apart. You thought you knew who you were and had yourself figured out. And now you're realizing that the person you've been presenting to the world and to yourself is at least partially a construction. A carefully maintained facade that's been protecting you from the harder truths you weren't ready to face. This is the grief that comes with self-knowledge. The mourning of all the versions of yourself that you have to let die in order to become more real. You grieve the illusion of your own innocence. The comfortable story where everything that went wrong was someone else's fault. Where you were always doing your best, always acting with good intentions, always more sinned against than sinning. The person you thought you would become slips away too. The one who would have it all figured out by now. The one who wouldn't still be struggling with the same patterns, still making the same mistakes, still wounded by the same old wounds. You grieve the relationships that can't survive your honesty, the ones that were built on who you were pretending to be rather than who you actually are. Being real in those spaces means being too much or not enough, and your growth makes other people uncomfortable because it highlights their stagnation. And perhaps most painfully, you grieve the safety of not knowing. Because once you understand why you do what you do, you can no longer do it unconsciously. The ability to blame your behavior on your circumstances, or your past, or your personality disappears. You become responsible for yourself in a way that's exhausting and terrifying and offers no easy escape. There's a loneliness in this too, a loneliness that comes from realizing that no one else can do this work for you. No therapist or partner or friend can excavate your psyche and hand you back a neat explanation of who you are. They can accompany you, they can hold space for you, but the actual work of understanding yourself is something only you can do. And even when you do it, even when you achieve some measure of clarity about who you are and why you are the way you are, there's no guarantee that anyone else will understand, or that they'll like what they see when you stop performing. True self-knowledge makes you less palatable and less easy to categorize. It makes you less willing to contort yourself into shapes that make other people comfortable. You become more particular, more boundaried, more likely to disappoint people who are relying on you to stay the same. Saying no to things that don't serve you becomes easier. Speaking up about things that bother you becomes necessary. And making choices based on who you actually are rather than who you think you should be becomes the only option. Not everyone will appreciate this. Some people will call you selfish, some will say you've changed and not in a good way, and some will feel abandoned because you're no longer available in the ways that they'd grown accustomed to. And you'll have to bear that. The discomfort of being misunderstood, the pain of outgrowing relationships that meant something to you, the vulnerability of showing up as yourself even when yourself isn't universally appealing. This is the price of authenticity. Not that you become difficult or unkind, but that you become real. Reality is always more complicated than the simplified versions of ourselves we present for public consumption. But here's the thing that makes it bearable. That makes it worth it. The alternative is worse. The alternative is spending your entire life as a stranger to yourself, making decisions that aren't really yours, building a life that looks good from the outside, but feels hollow from the inside. It's reaching the end of your days and realizing you never actually lived them. You just went through the motions of someone else's idea of what your life should look like. So yes, understanding yourself is uncomfortable and disorienting and painful. And it will cost you things you didn't expect to lose, but it will also give you something irreplaceable. The ability to live your life on purpose, to make choices that actually align with who you are, to build relationships based on truth rather than performance, to stop fighting yourself and start working with yourself. And slowly, imperceptibly, that internal war that's been raging inside you for as long as you can remember starts to quiet, Not because you've conquered yourself, but because you've finally stopped treating yourself like an enemy. So what changes when you truly understand yourself? And what does it actually look like to live from that place of clarity? It's subtler than you might expect, with no dramatic transformation. No sudden enlightenment where everything falls into place and you finally have all the answers. Self-understanding doesn't solve your problems or eliminate your struggles or make you immune to pain. But it does change the quality of your experience and the texture of how you move through the world. Space starts to appear between stimulus and response, that pause where you can choose how to react rather than simply reacting. It's brief, sometimes just a heartbeat, but it's enough. Enough to recognize when you're acting from fear rather than wisdom. Enough to catch yourself repeating a pattern before it fully unfolds. Enough to make a different choice, even a slightly different one. And over time, those small different choices accumulate into a different life. You get better at recognizing your own inner weather and can sense when a storm is building inside you, when you're about to lash out or shut down or spiral into anxiety. And instead of being swept away by it, you can name it. You can say to yourself or to the people you trust that you're struggling right now, that this is hard for you, that you need space or you need support, or simply that this isn't about them. That ability to name what's happening inside you, to claim it as yours rather than projecting it onto others, changes everything about how you relate to people. Your relationships become more honest, not necessarily easier, but more real. You're no longer trying to be someone you're not, no longer contorting yourself to fit into spaces that weren't meant for you. You stop abandoning yourself for the comfort of others, and you stop asking others to abandon themselves for yours. Saying things like, "I love you, but I can't help you with this right now," becomes possible without drowning in guilt. Expressing your needs without apologizing for having them becomes natural. Hearing no without interpreting it as rejection becomes easier, because you understand that other people's boundaries aren't about your worth any more than your boundaries are about theirs. Decision-making becomes clearer, not easier necessarily, but clearer. You're no longer trying to figure out what you should want or what would make you look good or what would prove something to someone who's probably not even paying attention. You're asking yourself what actually feels true, what aligns with who you actually are, not who you wish you were or who you used to be. And sometimes the answer surprises you. Sometimes you realize that the life you've been building, the goals you've been chasing, the identity you've been cultivating, none of it actually fits anymore. And that's terrifying, but it's also clarifying. Because now you can start building something that does fit, even if it's smaller or stranger or less impressive to other people. Defensiveness starts to fade away. And when someone criticizes you or points out something you did wrong, you can hear it without your entire sense of self collapsing. Not because criticism doesn't hurt, it still hurts, but because you're no longer identifying so completely with your mistakes. You can hold both truths at once, that you messed up and that you're still okay, that you have work to do and that you're not broken. This doesn't mean you become perfect or that you stop hurting people or that you never repeat your patterns, because you do and you will. Understanding yourself doesn't make you infallible, but it does make you more accountable. And when you know your patterns, when you understand your triggers and your defense mechanisms and the ways you tend to cause harm, you can't pretend they're not there. You have to take responsibility for them. You have to do the work of managing yourself instead of expecting the world to accommodate your dysfunction. And here's the paradox. This responsibility feels less burdensome than the unconscious patterns did, because at least now you're choosing. At least now you have some agency in how you show up. You also become more forgiving of yourself and of others, because once you've excavated your own psyche and seen how complex and contradictory you are, how many of your behaviours stem from old wounds and adaptive strategies, you can extend that same understanding to other people. You stop needing them to be simple. Stop expecting them to be consistent. Stop judging them for their contradictions and their struggles and their humanness. Everyone is doing exactly what you're doing, trying to navigate life with imperfect information and unhealed wounds and patterns they inherited from people who inherited them from people who inherited them. Everyone is doing their best with the tools they have, even when their best is insufficient. even when it causes harm. This doesn't mean you accept mistreatment or stay in relationships that hurt you. And understanding why someone behaves the way they do doesn't obligate you to endure it. But it does soften your heart, makes it easier to set boundaries without bitterness, to walk away without hatred, to protect yourself without demonizing others. And perhaps most of all, understanding yourself makes you less afraid of being alone. You're no longer abandoning yourself in every interaction, no longer fragmenting yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. And you discover that your own company isn't something to be avoided. You find that you can sit with yourself in silence without immediately reaching for distraction, that you can feel your feelings without needing to numb them or fix them or explain them away, that you can be with yourself in all your complexity and contradiction and find it not just tolerable, but interesting, even sometimes enjoyable. This doesn't mean you don't need people anymore, because you do, and we all do. Connection is part of what makes us human. But you need people differently now, not to complete you or save you or distract you from yourself, but to witness you, to meet you in your fullness and reflect back to you the truth of who you are. And when you find those people, the ones who can hold space for your complexity, who don't need you to be simple or consistent or always okay, those relationships become deeper than anything you've known before because they're built on truth rather than performance, on acceptance rather than approval. This is what it means to live as yourself, not some perfected version, not the version you think you should be, but the version you actually are. Flawed and evolving and perpetually learning, still carrying wounds but no longer defined by them, still making mistakes but taking responsibility for them, still uncertain about so many things but certain at least of this. You know yourself enough to trust yourself. You've done the hard work of looking inward and you're willing to keep doing it. Because you've discovered that the alternative, living as a stranger to yourself, is no longer an option. And while there's no final destination, no point where you fully arrive and the work is done, there is this: a growing sense of alignment between who you are on the inside and who you are on the outside. A feeling of coming home to yourself, of finally being able to rest in your own skin. That is what it truly means to understand yourself, not to have all the answers, but to be willing to ask the questions, not to be perfect, but to be real, not to be finished, but to be present with who you are right now, in this moment, exactly as you are.